Welcome. On behalf of everyone at IDG, we want to welcome you to Macworld. This is the 30th presentation of Macworld. 30 years. Let's just see how many people in the room, this is their first Macworld. Oh, well, welcome. That's really awesome. Thank you very much. How many have been coming for 5 years? How many have been coming for 10 years? 10 years. 15 years. This is fantastic. 20 years. 20 years. How many have come to every Macworld that we've ever done? You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. So we're going to start Macworld a little bit differently this year, and what I thought is for our community of people who are so invested in Apple, we're passionate users, we're passionate customers, we watch the industry, we're interested in what Apple does, we're interested in what the broader industry does. I thought it would be appropriate to start the event this year with a keynote where we have a bunch of people who spend their whole lives watching Apple to talk to us about the state of Apple in 2014. So please welcome my good friend and my colleague, Editorial Director Jason Snell.
Hi, Paul.
Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thanks.
This year, for the 30th anniversary of Macworld, we are dedicating this show to the memory of Pat McGovern.
For those of you who don't know, Pat McGovern was the founder of IDG, which is the company behind this show, Macworld, PC World, Computer World, and many other publications.
Pat passed away on March 19th, and there would be no Macworld without Pat McGovern, and he leaves behind an amazing legacy of innovation and leadership and philanthropy. So thank you, Pat.
And on behalf of everybody who works at IDG or has worked at IDG or has ever attended Macworld Expo, we dedicate this show to Pat McGovern's memory.
All right, you ready to do a panel?
Yeah, let's do a panel.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks, Paul.
All right.
Hi, folks. I'm Satya Nadella. I'm the CEO of Microsoft. I'd like to introduce Office for iPad. No. I'd like to introduce my panel. Let's bring them out. I've got a great panel for you today. Come on down. Pick up your turkey. I'm the editorial director at IDG Consumer. My panelists, I'm going to describe them as they come on stage because we'll save time that way. It's Christina Bonnington from Wired. Ben Bajarin, who writes at TechPinions and is at Creative Strategies. He's an analyst and a writer. Rene Ritchie from iMore. And down at the end, so we can surround the panel, is my colleague at Macworld, Dan Morin. You can applaud Dan, it's okay. So we've got a lot to talk about. We've got not a lot of time to talk about it. I think it'll be tricky to get through everything. We should start with the obvious, which is how Apple is totally doomed.
Doomed. So doomed.
Yeah, I mean...
Well, it's been nice, guys. See you later.
Having read Haunted Empire, I mean, the proof is right there that Phil Schiller listens to Led Zeppelin. It's all over.
He drives a Lamborghini, too, so really,
what I
writing's
hear.
on the wall.
It may be a time machine, too. I'm not quite sure. We should start with, I mean, there's so much to talk about. We might as well start. There was a wonderful story, and I'm being sarcastic there, about how Apple must release a smartwatch in 60 days, or it's all over. Which I think that's nice to know. It's good to put a clock on anything, really. But I wanted you guys to talk a little bit about the rumors about what Apple's going to do next in new product categories, about wearables, about, we'll get to TVs in a little bit. Gene Munster's heart will flutter when he knows we're talking about an Apple TV. But wearables, we've heard a lot about a smartwatch. I've got a Pebble on my wrist right now. I think it's an interesting category, but I'm curious what you think Apple is going to do. And you don't need to say what they should do, but what do you think Apple's going to do in 2014 in wearables? Christina, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the wearable space is growing a lot. I've got a Garmin VivoFit on my wrist. Woo! But yeah, the space is super small right now, super niche. But I feel like Apple could do some. I mean, there's a whole bunch of signs that Apple's investing in health and fitness, so Apple could do something in there. And that's. I mean, I feel like the iPhone has a lot of promise in that. You have it on you all the time, and you've got all these sensors. You could have it on your wrist. You've got a lot of blood vessels there. You could be sensing a lot of things. So that's something that seems like a complete, kind of different direction from, these big consumer products that Apple has worked on in the past that Apple could go in.
Ben, what do you think the opportunity for Apple is in wearables?
So I think a number of things. I mean, my firm does quite a bit of research on a whole load of these categories that we're talking about, and obviously wearables and Internet of Things and how those fit into are a big part of it. And, one of the things that we always try to explain about Apple is that they make computers that are small, medium, and large, and everything else sort of is wrapped around that ecosystem. And so when you look at what really the opportunity for wearables is, we look at the market size, it's not big. People project it to be big, but I think there's still some issues with kind of the analysis that's going into how big this could be. I think there's still a lot of problems about why people might want these things. I mean, general activity monitors are not really all that interesting to your mass market. And again, we look at categories that are very big. We care about mass market categories, as does Apple. And I think we're still waiting to see whether or not this wearable space is by itself a mass market. But one of the challenges with it is that, one, all the data that we have in researching this market says it's not a one-size-fits-all market, which means that even if Apple releases one of these, they cannot cover the breadth and depth of what global consumers will want with one of those devices. So I'm of the perspective that the best thing that they can do, whether they make one or whether they make a smartwatch or not, which I have opinions on whether they will, but whether they do that, the best thing to do is enable an ecosystem that those work best with iOS. And if they take a strategy that says these things, these peripherals, these accessories, you go out and build the glucose monitor, you go out and build the ultrasound, because we're not going to do it, but we want it to work best with iOS, is the best way that they can cover this very big market. And then the last thing I'll say is that these are very low margin products, and Apple would have to sell 10x what they sell on iPhone for it to make a blip on the revenue radar. And so if you look at that and you say, well, what does Wall Street want? Does Wall Street want them to show revenue growth? If so, I don't think this is the one way to do it. I think there's a lot of other ways that they can do it. And those, I think, are just some of the underlying challenges with just saying, hey, they should just make one of these. There's some real market issues as well as revenue things that have to be thought about.
I think you mentioned something there that I was thinking about the other day, which is that actually while I was talking to Rene, we were having lunch, and we were talking about the opportunity in wearables for Apple or anybody really in terms of money compared to the smartphone market. And you mentioned it being a hub around the smartphone, and that's what struck me, is that if you're expecting the Apple to have a new iPhone level revenue line from wearables, you're crazy. Where the iPhone may be more boring and smartphones in general because we've had them for a while, but that's where the money is. That's the huge market.
But it's also the volume. Our firm estimates by 2018 we'll sell 1.8 billion smartphones annually every year, and from that might play art. There's just no market as big as that. And you look at tablets are on a growth phase. We think they can hit 1 billion in annual shipments just by nature of how large those things are. So those are big mass markets. And I look at how do you create an ecosystem around those. Wearables could be one, but it's not going to be the next iPhone. It's not going to be your next big category.
Right. So Rene, are we calibrating our expectations properly for this? It sounds like everybody has let this run away from them completely in terms of excitement.
No, I mean, that's absolutely correct. And to go back to your original point about Apple has to make one in 60 days or they're doomed, the people who say that are not our friends. They are financial analysts. Their job is to move stock, not to inform consumers. They are saying that not because they think it's true or they want it to be true, but because they have people they told 2 days ago to do something with stock, and now they want to move the market that way. So Apple traditionally has two kinds of businesses. They have the hero products like iPhones and iPads and Macs, and then they have the things that increase the value of their ecosystems, like the Apple TV, like the routers, everything that makes owning those products better. And there's not a lot of smartwatches being sold. The smartwatch companies will tell you they're like in the early Palm Pilot days, and Apple does not enter those markets. Apple waits until there are Trios, Blackberries, and they can see the pain those are causing, and they think they have a really good solution. So there was 10 years of tablet PC, there was 10 years of smartphones. There's been very few years of smartwatches, so what makes more sense, to Ben's point, is that market where you have a band that you can wear a watch too if you want. It's not replacing your watch, and it just does things. And thanks to software on the iPhone, whether it's a health book or something else, other things just work very well with it. So the idea is it doesn't sell like the iPhone, but it makes the iPhone sell more. It makes it more valuable. It's the gym club membership that you get, and maybe you don't use, but it sounds really appealing up front.
That's very good, very good. Dan, would you buy a smart ring? Or a smart hat?
I don't really wear a lot of jewelry.
Smart shoe?
I was going to say, a lot of people don't realize that Apple has already been in the wearables markets. Who remembers iPod socks? So really, it seems pretty clear to me where they're going with it. No, I've become more and more convinced that the fitness sort of angle is where they're going to come at it, and a lot of that is because we've talked a lot about smartwatches. Like Jason and I have a Pebble. I think it doesn't. It's an ill-defined category, and the nice thing about fitness is it's very specific. It has an application, and it's a defined category that a lot of people have made devices in. And to Renee's point about Apple entering existing categories, it seems like there have been a few years of fitness trackers now. It's something they can look at and say, okay, we're identifying a few things that we want to do, and we think we can do better than what's already out there. And the thing that interests me about it the most is that it seems like an opportunity for Tim Cook to show something that he is actually passionate about. Because if you read interviews with him or you hear him speak, he talks a lot about fitness. He's, by all accounts, kind of a fitness nut. He talked at the D conference a few years ago about having a Nike Fuel Band. So I could easily see him saying, this is something I'm really interested in, something I think I could bring passion to bear on and turn this into a product that people will really use, people like me who are really interested in fitness would use. And so I think this idea of it could be sort of the first product we see coming out of a Tim Cook's Apple. And I think that to me seems much more interesting and much more fleshed out than something like a smartwatch, which is still kind of, doesn't do everything that you want it to do, does too many things at the same time. So that at least lets them focus their efforts. And of course, Apple really likes focusing on, let's solve this problem.
I like having a notification on my wrist, and that's why I like the Pebble, but it's not going to change the world. It's not going to appeal to everybody, and that's why we're definitely, I think, setting up for you can write the stories now, the waves of disappointment at whatever Apple does, because it's not going to be the next iPhone. It's just not. It's going to be interesting. It's going to fit into their ecosystem. It'll succeed or it won't, but even if it succeeds wildly, it's part of a larger story. It's not the next big, brand new category that's going to change everything for everybody, like the smartphone did.
And not to belabor the point, but Apple also, again, they're really, really patient. The first iPhone didn't even have 3G. The first iPad had no camera. Apple is building an iWatch or an iBand for 4 generations down. It took a long time to get to the MacBook Air, the iPad Air to get to the iPhone 5. And we'll probably see the same thing with whatever they do on the wrist. The first one will do a couple interesting things. 4 years later, it'll be fantastic.
And we can all agree, at least, that the first Apple wearable will have a physical keyboard on it, right?
If you go back to the Mac, this is Apple's playbook from way back, because Apple was late to the USB party in some ways, but it was the definitive USB and it made the USB market happen. It was very late with Bluetooth, but once its Bluetooth implementation was out there, everybody was like, oh, right, Bluetooth, and it changed things. So this is Apple's playbook. They lie in wait for that moment, and then they strike like a ninja.
iNinja.
Or a sniper. Or ninjas need wearables, too, because they don't have pockets.
That's true.
Throwables. They need throwables.
Throwables.
Let's talk about ninjas. No, let's talk about TV. Analyst Gene Munster has been flogging the TV. Apple needs to build a TV for like 10 years now. If you keep saying it, eventually either you'll be right or you'll be dead and it won't matter. So what do you think about Apple's, we'll start with Dan. What do you think about Apple's approach to TV? Are we going to see a TV set? Are we going to see a new Apple TV that's got more features? Or is Apple kind of just not able to solve this because of how intractable the TV market is?
It's a really hard market to break into, and I think they've tried a bunch of different things. They've thrown themselves at this problem over the last decade in a number of ways and just haven't been able to find purchase. And so we end up with the Apple TV, which is a great product, but it's kind of the most that Apple can do on its own without anybody, without deals with specific cable providers or what have you. I think there's some problems left to solve there. One of the things I'd love to see on a new Apple TV, and this could even be something potentially just on an updated version of the current Apple TV, is some sort of central clearinghouse. Like, if I want to go and watch a television show right now, I've got tons of options, right? It might be on Netflix, it might be on Hulu, it might be on the iTunes Store, it might be on multiple ones of these. And so some sort of unified user interface where I can type in, hey, I want to watch the latest episode of Arrow, and like, what service can I watch this on? And it could pop up like, oh, you can watch this on Hulu for free with ads, you can go over and watch it on iTunes if you're willing to pay a couple bucks for it. I think it's got this very disparate content model right now with all these deals, but it needs to find a way to bring it together and simplify it. That's really what we don't have right now. Right now, it seems like Apple is just sort of throwing things out there and be like, all right, we got these more deals with these guys and these guys and these guys, but it needs to find a way to consolidate that and turn it into a single usable product. I don't think it'll be a television with a screen, because that just seems too tricky in terms of like we're introducing multiple screen sizes? What
I
if
don't
it's-
want to buy a new TV every 2 years. When the
Exactly.
software
You're going to line up for it, Jason.
So Rene, what do you think?
So it's interesting, a little bit inside baseball. A lot of analysts, when they do these predictions, they look at supply chains, they see what the factories are ordering and what they're building. So a few years ago, Gene Munster heard something about 27-inch displays, and he thought, hey, television. Turns out it was a 27-inch iMac. Now there's rumors about 4K displays. Hey, television. No, there's a high likelihood we'll get a new Thunderbolt display at some point. It's Occam's razor for these things. It's not a great business. You can go back to Steve Jobs' All Things Digital talk where he explained, Apple is not a technology company. They don't think, oh, this is a great chipset, what can we do? They think, this is the feature set we want, how can we enable it? And the idea of Apple is always go to market. How do we make this a mainstream product that everyone is going to use? We want to ship hundreds of millions of these things. And that, to Dan's point, that little box can do a lot of things. Give it spotlight search, give it some more RAM, some more storage, so maybe there'll be an app store, maybe just a game app store, but that would be a big hit. And then you still have the cable companies, which make the carriers look like hippies. They are tiny feudal fiefdoms that own networks, that lock down content, that treat their users as hostile forces that are working against them. Apple as a box can get around all that. Apple trying to be a television set that provides all your TV is going to constantly have heartbreak thanks to Comcast.
If you think Rene is bitter about this, he lives in Canada where they get nothing.
We get nothing.
Yeah.
So he's extra mad about
If
it.
you guys get a Comcast deal, I still get nothing.
There's one channel in Canada.
That's right.
And it's cold.
It's the CBC, and it just shows snow falling all year round. Occasionally a moose walks by, and that's it. Ben, what do you think about Apple and TV? What are the opportunities for Apple here?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this space. I mean, we study the TV sector quite a lot, and obviously it's a low margin business. So we talk with a lot of the different global TV manufacturers, and there's sort of this general trend now and theme that everybody's embracing, which is dumb glass smart box. And so I think that that's really the cleanest way to do it. I mean, people hold on to large pieces of glass for long periods of time. They're outdated very quickly. You can refresh boxes with better silicon, better content, any number of things with better software. So I've sort of always been of the opinion that it's just, you cover your broadest markets by doing a box. With that said, I still think, again, like Dan said, it's an extremely challenging market. Before I became an industry analyst, I was in entrepreneurship. I started a bunch of companies. One of the ones we started was trying to help bring technology to the entertainment industry. And I recall this.
And they said, no, we're not interested.
Yeah, well, it was. They do if you give them, $100 million.
Oh.
But one of the things that we learned very early on, we were trying to do a deal with Universal, was that I was in this sort of conversation with a couple of their executives, and there was 2 of us, and there was 8 lawyers. And I was like, there's more lawyers than there were of any of the 2 of us. And you realize after a short amount of time, this is not going to go anywhere when you have to renegotiate contract rights for 15 different things, and you ask questions about who gets played, what's an airtime. I mean, it's just really, really complicated. And these are the things that this archaic entertainment broadcast industry that has contracts that date back to the 50s are not prepared for the modern era. And so that's why, whether it's do something with Comcast, whether bringing it over the top is a really big issue. And I think a lot of people sort of miss that broadcast is still a very fundamentally important part of most people's TV's experience. And maybe not your small 10 to 15% of the techies, but your mass market still uses broadcast. And that has to be a play of any TV solution. And this is a global reality, not just a US one. And that's where I think there's gonna be a lot of challenge to bring that to bear.
Yeah, if we saw the BBC announce that they were going to do iPlayer worldwide, and then they sort of said, look over there, and ran the other way, because it's so complicated to do a lot of digital products. We've discovered that the internet has made everything worldwide, but all of the licensing agreements, all of the rights are regional, and they're country by country, and it makes it impossible. There's some sites have. I forget, Rene's site might have even done this. It's the map of where different services are available. Yeah. And it's amazing because we think of Apple's actually one of the better countries in terms of having a global reach compared to Amazon and Netflix.
We have no Google Music. I mean, we basically have iTunes and a little bit of Netflix.
Yeah. But all those moose, so
you
really
are lucky to have
positive.
Electricity.
We import it.
Y'all have
Christina?
Justin Bieber too, right?
We sent him out.
Yeah.
What do you think about Apple and TV?
I think the opportunity for Apple really lies in the software and the user experience, and really being able to tie in the whole iOS and Mac ecosystem into your living room experience as well, and just making that super easy to use. And I also think, I know Apple's, patent activity isn't a roadmap. It's just you can kind of get a glimpse of, what they're exploring and stuff. And Apple has a lot of stuff in 3D gesture interface technology that they've been kind of exploring. There's all sorts of different patents that they've been working on. So I kind of feel like Connect, 3D, just easy gestures, will be something that's part of whatever that television experience is.
I wrote one of my least favorite articles that I've ever written, but it was trying to imagine what the next Apple TV looked like. And I was looking at the Connect in my living room and thinking, you could make a box with smarter sensors and a camera, and you could throw in FaceTime, and you could throw in maybe some gestures, and you could do some things to make it smarter, but it's still that outside box. And Ben, what you said about dumb glass, the people who make the glass, the people who make those HDTVs, they want it all to be smart, right? It's just like the wireless carriers and the cable company not wanting to be dumb pipes. They want to add features. But if you're not in that business and you're in the business of the box, why would you want to get in the business of the glass? It doesn't make a lot of sense. I do think Apple wants to find ways to make this experience better. My TiVo can sort of amalgamate the different streaming services, but it's a huge UI challenge that Apple would actually, I would love to see an Apple implementation of that.
The flip side of that is I have 7 devices connected to my TV. They can all play Netflix, which is great, I guess.
Including the TV.
Yeah, I have the TV, I have a Chromecast, an Apple TV, an Xbox, a Mac Mini. It's like I can watch the same content on 5 different devices.
Well, and one of the things I think that gets overlooked, and I think is perhaps the broader potential, and it's obviously highly speculative, but I think perhaps one of the more interesting angles of this is that it may or may not, again, just be the broadcast content itself that becomes interesting, but we think, could the TV become the next major app platform is, I think an interesting line of thinking. If you look at the history of platforms, you had the PC became a platform thanks to an SDK, you had phones and tablets become platforms thanks to an SDK, and so I think the question is, could developers now turn the TV into a new platform, and then what might that yield over time in the future? We've never really had that before, and so that I think is interesting, but that's, again, I think a separate discussion from, hey, I just want to watch TV, to maybe my experience may change, integrate with second screens in new ways that it couldn't before, and those could tip the iceberg.
Well, Apple TV runs iOS.
Yep.
So it's not, people have been talking about this for a few years now. It's not unreasonable to think of an app store for Apple TV that developers could use a lot of the same frameworks they use for iOS apps, and take advantage of all those iOS developers to either create apps that run on the Apple TV or apps that interact between an iOS device and what's on your TV screen. There are questions about gaming controllers and all of that, although presumably your iPhone or your iPad would be a great gaming controller on its own. I think there's a huge opportunity. They just haven't gone there yet, but maybe, again, like we were saying earlier, they're waiting for the right moment to strike, like a ninja. Again, back to the ninjas. Let's shift gears and talk about the Mac. This is Macworld / iWorld. Remember the Mac? It's been around a while. This year we've seen, yay, the Mac!
Some Mac fans in the audience.
I didn't want to say it last, because people would be like, why aren't they talking about the Mac? It's like, yes, the Mac. We have Mavericks now. We've got a lot of interesting hardware out there, but it's the beginning of 2014. It's a new year. Not a lot happened in Apple's hardware release yet, so it's like, what happens next? The Mac Pro came out at the very end of last year. Where do you think the Mac is going in terms of the hardware and the software in 2014? Let's start with Ben.
Oh, all right. Yes, lots of thoughts on the Mac also.
I got you here because you have many thoughts.
We are very actually optimistic as the Mac as a growth story for Apple. We study the PC industry. My firm's heritage is in studying the PC industry, and so we look at all of these trends, and obviously we've seen it take sort of a dip, pretty steep decline, and there's obviously some very good reasons as to why that's happened. But when you look at kind of the overall market and what's happening, we've had to now make a very clear line between the commercial segment and the consumer segment of personal computers, that open and look like desktops or notebooks. And that's really where I think we're on the cusp of a fairly big refresh cycle. A stat that I like to throw out that I think not a lot of people get is that there's a little bit over 350 million PCs in use that are 4 years or older. And there's going to come a point in time for this demographic and the install base of PCs is somewhere around 1.5 billion, depending on who you talk to. But if you look at the usage, most of those are people who know they need them for daily work and use. use, and so those will be refreshed. And so then the question is, what will they be refreshed by? And we continually see market data that says that both enterprises are not in love with Windows 8, that even many consumers are still confused and not in love with Windows 8. More importantly, people are holding on to their devices longer, so they're willing to make an investment. So premium now is actually a growth category. So all of those things, I think, favor Apple well. I think they've got a big commercial opportunity. I was on a panel at Mac IT yesterday, and we were seeing obviously the folks that were in attendance, a big swing in interest in deploying Macs. So I think that's an interesting growth story. I mean, if Apple could get to say 20-30% of the overall annual PC shipments, that would be a tremendous revenue boost for them. It would be something that Wall Street would freak out over because it would be so significant because of their margins. Those, I think, is interesting. So we're very optimistic as a growth story.
Yeah, and this goes back to how people view market share in a skewed way, where people look at the PC market and say, well, it's shrinking, it's not going to be as relevant. But if Apple can swallow up the high end of the PC market and leave very little behind to make profit on, that's their game. That's what they're there for.
Yep.
Rene, where do you see the Mac going?
I'm really excited about the Mac for a lot of the same reasons as Ben, but when you look at what Apple's been doing lately with the Mac, what I like is that for most of us, Phil Schiller's Mac Pro aside, computers are fast enough. You can do any common task that you really want to do most of the time on all the computers we have today. So I think Apple really smartly identified the next area of pain. Once we get the computer performant enough, we want to make it last really long time. And there's that famous story of Steve Jobs just walking into the Mac meeting, and they had everything prepared. They had their list of features. They were going to tell him, we're going to spend 8 hours talking about the future of the Mac. And he comes in and drops the iPad in front of them, says, why can't my Mac do this? And a couple years later, now the Mac, once again, battery life longer than an iPad. You can take it. I used to go to coffee shops and leave when my battery was done. I'm shutting down coffee shops now. It is the most amazing thing.
You should buy more coffee.
I should buy more shops.
You don't have to go home, but your Mac can't stay here.
It's fantastic. And I think when you get to OS 10.10, we're probably going to see that at WWDC. That will continue. We have new chipsets. Haswell was fantastic. It was so good. I think we might not even see a Mac on ARM at some point. You'll have Broadwell, so it'll go even longer, even thinner, even smaller. Previously, they couldn't make a Retina Air just because you didn't have enough battery. But now you're getting to the point where that's a really viable product now.
And we're solving for battery more than we're solving for speed, right? Because speed, it's fast enough, like you said. We're solving for things like battery life.
You used to have to choose between weight, battery life, and Retina, and you could have 2 of the 3. And last year with iOS, they got to the point where you didn't have to choose anymore. And I think this year, maybe early next year with the Mac, you will no longer have to take those compromises anymore either.
As a MacBook Air user, I'm very excited about the prospect of a new MacBook Air with Retina if they can make it, and there are rumors out there about it, but if they can make it still have decent battery life, I would be very excited about that. You guys MacBook Air users, anybody?
Yeah. I use both. I have a Pro at home and I travel with the Air because again, it lasts forever.
Oh, the luxury. Christina, where do you think the Mac is going?
I agree, battery life, and then also I'm really hoping for a Retina iPad Air, MacBook Air this year. I think they've been working on that technology for a couple of years now, and I think this could be the year that they've got the battery efficiency down and the display manufacturing process down well enough that they can get it in the MacBook Air package.
That'd be nice.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't feel like I need Retina on the Mac like I do on the iOS. On the iOS with the Google, you get the iOS. But it's sure nice. It's a nice to have. I'd love to have it.
Well, and I think what Rene said becomes interesting too. If you think about, I tend to think that Apple controlling their own processor is actually one of the most underappreciated strategic advantages that they have. And if they brought a version of that to the Mac Air line or something like that, for example, that could be actually a big win for enterprise because you can do a lot of unique things security-wise on the chip, which can be both lock to chip and then to software and then hardware to services, and so it fits kind of their vertical stack. But they can do some very differentiated things at that point in time, and that would help battery life as well. But even from just the x86 front, Intel's roadmaps are pretty aggressive for battery life, which favors, I think, again, being able to go to Retina even in the Air.
I think Apple likes having the out, not being trapped with Intel, and it may actually even help them with Intel, right?
No,
Intel knows, if you can't do this, we got this chip over here.
Yeah, they're very concerned.
It's sort of Damocles above Intel's head.
Dan, where do you think the Mac is going? And I'm especially interested in wondering, or in asking you about the look of the Mac. We didn't see an iOS 7 style refresh of the Mac interface. Do you think we're going to see that this year?
Well, I mean, when you ask when the Mac is going in a word, I think that word is ninjas. No, ninjas.
So it's going there quietly, and we
Yeah,
should be able to see
I mean,
where it's going.
we've already identified a lot of those things. I just said the look of the Mac is really interesting. In some ways, the Mac fundamentally hasn't changed in 30 years, right? I mean, if you look at it, it's still the same menu bar. There's an Apple menu. There's icons. There's folders, right? And not a lot has changed. It's been refined gradually over time, and we've gotten more and more capabilities. But I think Apple has reached a point where they're pretty comfortable with the user interface conventions that we have now. And so, yeah, I think we'll see continuing refinements, but I don't know that we'll see anything as wide sweeping as we saw with iOS 7. iOS is still a relatively young operating system. There's a lot of change.
It's a teenager.
Yeah, it's going through a phase. It's dying its hair purple. And so I think that the Mac is much more, I guess, mature, in a word. And it has a lot of ingrained users who are used to the way it works. And so I think we're going to see them continue to expand on the capabilities that we can do in software, and especially in their sweet spot, which is the combination of software and hardware. And as we were, battery life obviously came up a lot, and improving the battery hardware-wise is important. And I think that Apple's definitely looking into technologies to do that. The power management side on the software is equally important. A lot of what we've seen from Apple in the last few years is under the hood improvements. We haven't seen a lot that's like, wow, this is a flashy brand new feature that you can do on your Mac. And I think that will continue as a trend. They're going to keep working on getting stuff under the surface that works really well and does so transparently. And while that may not be sexy, for lack of a better word, I think it's one of those things that we take for granted, but it's important that our Macs last longer and work quickly and don't slow down. You don't hit beach balls all the time. And so, there's still a lot of possibility. There's still a lot of life left in the Mac. For me, I have an iPad and an iPhone, but my MacBook Air still goes with me on every trip just because there's no replacement for it from the standpoint of having a keyboard and being able to do all these different things at once. I love my iPad, but it doesn't work for me. So there is a convergence sort of going on. We're moving the iPad and the MacBooks are getting closer and closer together, and we can see the trends in both cases: Retina displays, longer battery life, solid state storage. I think we're going to see those continue to improve and spread throughout Apple's lineup, but I think there are still two distinct paths there going forward.
When I talked to the Apple executives for the 30th anniversary of the Mac, it was an interesting shift, I think, that Apple has taken in the Mac from a couple years ago. The idea that these devices would converge, that with Mountain Lion and Lion, we saw things that were similar, very similar interface-wise on both platforms. And I feel like that's not, they don't want to do that now. They're like, why would we do that? We want these to be different. The Mac is not the iPad. It's different. It should be different. They want them to work together. And there's also, I think Apple is making the assumption now that these devices don't converge. You use your phone for phone things, your iPad for iPad things, and your Mac for Mac things. And that most of their customers have all of these things and aren't looking to just have one device. And that's a different approach, and I think you're right. I think that's where the Mac is going, is being comfortable in its own skin and wanting to work with what we've been talking about, the ecosystem of Apple products, but not trying to become an iPad, because we already have the iPad.
Yeah, that said, it's clear that the iPad and the iPhone are broadening in terms of their capabilities, and the Mac market is getting smaller. And just because, as much as many of us need the Mac, there's a lot of people for whom an iOS device is good enough. It does 80-90% of what they need to do. I mean, we replaced, my aunt had an old PC laptop, and we were trying to get that thing out of her house for ages, and it finally came up that the only thing she needed it for was printing. So we bought her a new printer that works with her iPad, and now all she has is the iPad, and it works great. And that's going to be true for a lot of people. There's a lot of people that can get by perfectly with something that's, an iPad that they can stick in a drawer when they're not using it, as opposed to a computer that's sitting out in their living room all the time, right, taking up space. So I think, there are challenges, and the Mac remains, but I mean, to go back to the Steve Jobs analogy that said it best, the Mac is a truck. The iOS devices might be more like cars. They'll still get you from point A to point B. They might be more efficient at doing that. Not everybody needs a Mac. But for the people who do need a Mac, it's still going to be around.
My mom had the exact same experience that your aunt had, which was she got an iPad. We got her an iPad. She's like, why do I need this? And then, cut to a year later, and she's like, I only ever open the computer to print.
Yeah.
And what was her Christmas present? An AirPrint printer.
That's what we did.
Now that laptop never gets opened, so the world changes. We should talk. Well, do you got any more about the Mac before?
Well, I
we
think
move
the
on?
point that you said that I would just emphasize is that the convergence, as we're seeing with Windows 8, is convergence causes confusion, and I think there's no clear delineation between what you should do and what you use, and I think we're in this very interesting stage right now in developed markets, in PC-centric markets, where most mass market consumers are sort of starting to ask the question: do I really need a new notebook or a new desktop? Could I get by with this thing like an iPad? And we're seeing more and more of that happen. And I don't think that shift has fundamentally happened yet. I think there's still a giant market for those who need these devices, which we say are good at deep work, but there's deep work and light work. And I think your mainstream consumers are now starting to figure that out, which is sort of where we're in this kind of perhaps pause area in the tablet growth sector. But I think, again, keeping the clear line between why you would want this versus why you want that is actually much more beneficial from a market standpoint than saying, hey, I'm going to blur these lines, and now you're just confused. You don't know what you want.
We're all still struggling with the idea that it used to be there was a whole set of tasks that only could be performed on a computer. And now we have these devices that we don't think of as computers that do those tasks. So it's like the internet used to be a computer thing, but now it's a phone thing and a tablet thing, and it's on your TV. And we're still all struggling with like, okay, what do I need to do? I used to assume that I needed a computer to do all those things. Some people will still need a computer, and other people won't because, like Dan's aunt and my mother, their set of tasks fits inside an iPad or an iPhone.
The only thing I'd add to that is, again, Apple's a really patient company, and they're a feature set, not a chipset company. So 5 years from now, what's a Mac and what's an iOS device? 10 years from now, what's a Mac and what's an iOS device? OS 10 and iOS may never converge, but to think that this is we're not stationary now. Mobile is the fastest moving thing I've seen in computer technology in a long time, and to think that 5, 10 years out, maybe there will be alternatives we don't even imagine now.
I can edit a podcast on my iPad now. It just takes 10 times as long. The power is actually there. It just takes way too long because touch interfaces are different from keyboard and mouse interfaces. In 5 or 10 years, it'll be a different world, but it's early days.
I always joke that I must be using my iPad wrong because we do quite a lot of our own productivity and spreadsheets and forecasts and all sorts of things. I don't create massive CGIs and things, but the stuff that we do, I can get pretty far on my iPad, and so I say, look, I must not be actually doing real work because apparently I'm using this wrong.
I covered all of CES on my iPhone, the entire show. My thumbs were a little sore, but it was, I was able to do it, and our readers, couldn't tell there was no drop in quality. It was fantastic, and it was so nice. Normally at the end of CES, my back hurts from carrying a backpack with my laptop and a camera and stuff in it. We're just using everything on the iPhone. Quality was great, so it was awesome.
Yeah, see, they don't need a truck. Dan, no trucks there.
We have SUVs, Dan.
Oh, okay.
Well, okay, so we're talking about iOS and how it interacts with the Mac. Let's talk about where the iPhone and the iPad are going in 2014. Lots of rumors about, hey, I heard a rumor there's going to be an iPhone 6. Shh, because I can count. There's talk about new iPhones, bigger screens. Obviously, one of the things that's happened in the smartphone market is that you see Android phones with large screens that sell pretty well, and Apple has oh, you're frowning. Okay, well, we'll start with you, Ben, because you're frowning. Do you think Apple needs to add a larger screened iPhone to their portfolio, or is it all just sort of silly talk?
I think yes, and I think you have to be careful when you look at what sells well where. So for example, the sales of Notes in this country have been borderline abysmal. I happen to know them, and it's not good. There's reasons for that. That's not just because, it's not to say that Apple shouldn't do it. I'm just giving the reality of where those bigger screens are in our market. In China, however, it's a very, very different story. You've got people who can't afford a tablet and a phone. They don't have PCs. They typically like bigger screen devices, and so this is why we see devices 5.5 inches and larger, very popular in emerging markets. So, but yeah, at the same time, you're not going to make the case that Apple should do this just to go to emerging markets. So I do think that they'll release a larger phone. I think even our supply chain data suggests yes, there will be something. It's not going to be 5.5 inch or probably larger than that. I think it'll be somewhere in your high 4s, 5 inch.
It's not going to be a phablet. It might be more like one of those Android phones that's a little larger.
Unless,
but it's not going to be a phone that you have to hold up to your.
It won't be a boombox, Jason.
No, like I said, those phones do well in markets where it costs less than $200 retail. So that's not the United States or Europe. So I do think, again, I think they're at this point in time. The U.S. and the Europe is in an interesting state that I think a lot of people sort of miss is that we are now in, on average, your third or fourth, for the most, a big percentage of the population, third or fourth smartphone. So we're well into replacement. And when that happens, the dynamics change quite a bit in the market. And this is where trying to get someone to upgrade, you kind of have to start to do some new things. You can't just do the normal things anymore. And I think, Apple knows this, Samsung knows this. There's a lot of carriers that understand this. And that's where a larger screened device, something that's taking advantage of new technology, latest generation, stuff like that, in that type of a package can actually move the needle, whereas if it didn't, you might see people hold their phones longer. So there's a lot of, I think, complex dynamics, but I do think that's coming. I think it'll be a big deal, and I do think they'll bring it to emerging markets as well, because that is something that is actually going to would do quite well in China, even at a high price. I think it would do extremely well in China.
Rene, where do you think the iPhone and iPad go from here?
Yeah, I think Ben makes an excellent case, especially when people said Apple waited too long for a big screen phone. If you go back a little while, Apple was outselling not only big screen phones, but every big screen phone combined in North America. People were choosing iOS on a small screen over every other phone on the big screen. Now, you take that back a few earlier years, Apple was exclusive to AT&T, so you had to choose AT&T, an iPhone on AT&T, or something else on another carrier. And that worked really, really well. But it got to a point where anybody who could or would use AT&T had an iPhone on it. Then they went to Verizon, and suddenly they had a bigger addressable market. They could sell more iPhones. And all Apple really wants to do is make great products, because making great products means they sell more and they have happier customers. So by increasing their market, they can now have people who have a bigger phone with iOS on it. Carrier markets in the US are subsidized. So imagine you go into Best Buy and every television set, regardless of size, costs $200. People start looking at the 120-inch television sets. It's only natural. You also have people in the third world, like Ben said, who can only afford one device and they need something bigger than a phone because it's their primary computer. But you have people in North America who only want to carry one device. Christina just said she did all of CES on an iPhone. You can do that better on a larger screen device because you can have, the same way an iPad had a higher class of software, Steve Jobs said you could make higher level apps, you can do that when you start increasing pixels and increasing screen sizes. So there's 4 or 5 problems that a bigger screen iPhone really fixes for Apple, and we're at a point now where they've incrementally gone to Retina, then to a taller screen, and it makes sense just in their product lineup that this year we might get a bigger screen phone. It just seems to fit so nicely.
I think the thing to remember is that all the people who decried the iPad as a big iPod Touch when it came out, like, oh, what's the point of that? I mean, the important thing to remember always with all the iOS devices is that the larger screen not only means room for more information, but it's also how you control and interact with that device. So it means different ways of interacting, things that you can do, gestures you can create that you can't do necessarily on a smaller device. The iPad has all these multi-finger gestures that you can do, and lots of app developers come up with clever ways that you can interact with it. And so having those larger control surface available on a phone opens up more possibilities. And I think that's an important thing, and that I don't necessarily, maybe I want a 27-inch iPhone, I don't know, but I think there's a sweet spot, right? Because right now they have an iPad Mini, which is of a certain size, and they have an iPhone 5 and 5S, which is of a certain size. There's a lot of room to play in there too, but they're going to spend a lot of time working on what is the right size to make this. How do we make this big without making it too big, because that is a concern. A friend of mine got a Droid X, I think, which was one of the first big screen phones, and it looked like he was carrying a tricorder around with him all the time. I think it was enormous.
Yeah, my problem with some of the bigger Android phones is it's just, I like to carry my phone in my pocket, so it needs to be small enough to fit in my pocket, and then using it with one hand. There's still a lot of times where I'm eating burrito with one hand and I'm typing on my phone in the other, and I don't want to have to put my burrito down and use both hands on my phone.
It's a burrito use case. It's very important.
And that's a software solvable problem too. And we saw, BlackBerry 10 tried to do that with more gestures. iOS 7 started putting a pervasive back gesture, so you don't have to go up to the back button at the top. You can just swipe from the bottom of the screen.
Wait, combination phone burrito. I think we found it. Convergence.
Sold by ninjas.
Let's start a rumor.
It's not a wearable, it's a burrito.
Yeah, I had somebody ask me the other day, I was talking about the new, the HTC One, and they said, I want an Android phone. If I'm going to leave the iPhone, I want an Android phone that's as small as an iPhone. Can I find one? I'm like, well, it's hard. They exist, but it's an interesting differentiation that's happening because, let's face it, the Android phone makers were all saying, how do we do something where we're not competing directly with the iPhone? How do we get out of its way? We could be bigger. Let's do that. And so that's one of the reasons there's that differentiation.
It's kind of funny because it's also the inverse of when you think about the iPod market, which I felt like kept getting smaller and smaller devices as you went along. But again,
until it got too small, even.
Right, exactly. Do you remember the Shuffle that didn't have any buttons on it?
Yeah, iClip Shuffle.
That was too small.
But it does seem like they have two screen sizes in every device. Like you can get the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, the iMac, the iPad in two screen sizes, and the iPhone is really the only one that has a new model in one screen size. And having two screen sizes there just seems like an Apple thing.
Well, and I think too, that's representative of a category's life cycle. As the category gets more mature, people's interests start changing. What they thought they wanted or what they started with adapts. That's why you see a breadth and depth of a product portfolio. I mean, everybody does it. Apple's done it. They're just, again, to Dan's point, they're very focused. So it's going to be about what's the right one, what's the right screen size in our lineup. But like I said, that goes back to my first point, which is that Apple makes computers small, medium, and large, and there will be very focused and very key, usable devices that fit their philosophy within small, medium, and large.
Oh, and if you're Apple, you pick the first device you make, you pick the largest market segment you can address.
Yep.
And then it's tricky when you have to pick a second, because you want to not, destroy your first, but you also don't want to pick something so wacky that nobody wants it. And so how do you set those cases? It'll be interesting to see. I want to talk about the iPad briefly, only because we've mentioned it, but help me out here. I try to envision where the iPad goes from here, and I'm like, you know what? The iPad's great. I have a Retina Mini. It's awesome. So where does the iPad go from here? What does the iPad? I feel like it's a great product, and I'm not quite sure how I need to be entertained by new things. Touch ID, I guess. I mean, where does the iPad go in 2014? Christina, what do you think?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, with the iPad Air and the new iPad Mini as well, it's got a wonderful screen. The processor is super fast. It's got just about all the features that I'd want, that I can imagine wanting on a tablet. I know when I was first using it, after using Touch ID, I would sit there for a couple seconds with my thumb on it and just wait.
Why won't it unlock?
Well, it won't unlock. So, I think that's a natural evolution of where the iPad could go. But yeah, I think it'll have to be, Apple would have to kind of throw something out of left field for me to want to invest in a new iPad, something that's, it's great as is for me, so I don't even know what Apple would have to do. I don't know, maybe it has holograms, Star Wars style.
Star Wars hologram edition. Cool.
Yeah.
Ben, what do you think?
I think Touch ID is a natural fit. We're seeing iPads be deployed in enterprises in just ridiculous numbers. Security is a huge deal there, and that's where that could really become in. I think at large, across every category, I think Apple's going to continue to take a leadership position in security, so I think that'll just be a natural thing that they'll do across all these devices. But I think there's a lot of opportunity still in software. Some data came out from Flurry yesterday that said that consumers are now starting to get interested in doing a little bit more productivity things, both on their phones and their tablets. We kind of don't have this massive market of people who are taking these slates by the grabbing them and going and doing everything that we see possible with it. Again, there's still use cases are very entertainment centric, like you said. So that's where I think there's still a lot of opportunity for software. Some of the best productivity apps are Apple's, and so when are we going to get developers out there creating better and pushing the envelope in terms of things that you can actually do, not just watch movies, play games, do things like that. So I think it's a software story. I think you're right on the hardware bit. It's kind of hard to really improve it enough to be truly a leapfrog in innovation.
It'll be faster and lighter.
Yeah. Those are natural. Again, maybe AMOLED comes to it. It's a screw, but again, those things aren't going to be truly leapfrogging, right, in innovation. So I think the software is one big area where I think we can start to move the needle with regards to the iPad.
I wonder if Microsoft Office will come on the iPad.
Yeah.
We'll see.
That's
Maybe
a commercial
today.
play, not a consumer one.
Yeah,
anyway,
it's definitely not a consumer story. Rene, what do you think about the iPad?
So the iPad Air just got refreshed, so it's unlikely we'll see a big change in that this year. It can always get faster. I'd love to see 4K video on it, because if you're a video professional, a big screen is what you want to get a really sharp image. I think the cameras are due for an upgrade. Touch ID, of course. I don't know if Apple would ever do a digitizer, but the artists among us would probably really like a digitizer built in. So just the ability to expand what it can do to cover more of those categories that it was originally announced for.
Yeah, the artists would definitely love some better digitizer support for.
Ben took the words right out of my mouth. Software, I think, is the biggest differentiator. As a blank slate, the iPad is like, I won't say it can't get any better, but it's pretty great the way it is. But I think certain things, the productivity, the ability to do multitasking, like true multitasking of some sort, I think it's a hard problem to solve. I don't think we'll see it this year, but I think it needs to happen sooner or later. Also, one little thing that I'd love to see is this more idea of like profile, the ability for a multi-user iPad. There's a lot of households that share an iPad among multiple people, and right now it's a mess. There's no good way to do that. So that's one of the things.
iPads.
Yeah, buy more iPads.
And
that's right.
iOS 7 feels like an OS that was really designed with the iPhone in mind, and the iPad was an afterthought. It would be nice if iOS 8 is a real iPad-focused release. That would be nice. Now, we're about out of time, so I want to run down who my panel is again, because I said it sort of fast at the beginning, and I want to let you know who these people are so you can find out all the cool stuff that they do. Christina Bonnington, you work at Wired. You are Red Girl Says on Twitter, and of course, co-host of the Gingercast, which is my favorite 6-second or less technology video podcast.
Exclusively with gingers.
Exclusively with gingers or people wearing red-headed wigs occasionally as guests. Ben Bajarin, you write at TechPinions. You are Ben Bajarin on Twitter. And Creative Strategies, is that the name of your firm? Yeah? All right. Got it. I'm 2 for 2. Rene Ritchie at iMore, a great place to go for everything about not just things, but Macs as well. And you have many, many podcasts.
I do.
And where is it? imore.com /
imore.com/podcast.
And Rene Ritchie on Twitter.
Rene Ritchie on every the social
on everything.
Thing. Yeah.
On everywhere you could think of. Dan Morin. Macworld.
Sure.
D Morin on Twitter.
I do a great tech podcast called
Clockwise, that Dan and I co-host, that's on techhive.com. And Dan and Lex Friedman have a podcast called Not Playing that's at notplaying.net.
Coming back for a second season sometime soon.
Where they watch movies they've never seen before that they really should have seen by now. And I'm Jason Snell. As Paul said, I'm the editorial director at IDG Consumer, Macworld, PC World, TechHive, and Greenbot, our new Android site. And in my spare time, I do The Incomparable at theincomparable.com. And thanks to everybody here for coming to the 30th Macworld Expo and to coming for our panel. I hope you have a great time visiting everything that there is in the sessions and on the show floor. Thanks a lot.